Hello, everybody. My name is Nishal Goburdhan. I'm an internet analyst that works at Packet Clearing House. And before I start, I'd like to say thank you to the AFRINIC capacity building team for having us here as a guest speaker on their webinar series on how to run internet exchange points. I hope that we'll have an engaging 2 hours. So my plan is not to speak for 2 hours, so don't worry. I hope that I'll speak a little bit about the theory of internet exchange points, how they're built and why we build them the way we build them, and specifically on how to run them and on problems that can happen when things don't work out as an internet exchange point. And I hope by that stage, the webinar team at AFRINIC will be able to stop me and ask me some of the questions that you've got. So a little bit about myself. As I said, my name is Nishal. I'm connecting to you from Johannesburg, South Africa. I work for Packet Clearing House. PCH is a global nonprofit. We provide support to internet exchange points from the core of the DNS, and we've been doing this very quietly in the background since 1993. So if you haven't heard of us, that's quite okay. I expect most of you would not, unless you're involved in core operations of the internet, like work at internet exchange points, or work at domain name systems or domain name registries around the world. There's a little bit more about PCH on that slide. If you're interested in us, if you want to see the kind of work that we do, please go to www.pch.net. But we're not here to talk about PCH. We're here to talk about the internet and how the internet interconnects and how to make that interconnection better. So right now you should be seeing on your screen what's loosely often called the map of the internet. It's not exactly the map of the internet. Technically, it's a conal map of the interconnections between the network operators. But if somebody had to ask you, draw the internet today, this is what you should be able to produce. Well, this is what computers produce. It's courtesy of CAIDA, a research organization in California. And what that should show you, what the map should show you, and don't worry if you can't read it, is that there's large networks, autonomous systems as we know them, that form a mesh that is so intricate it's almost impossible to describe. That's what the internet is today. It's a connection of more than 70,000 autonomous systems that interconnect across the major cities that you see listed there in a way that we're going to describe as we move on. And these interconnections happen in typically one of two ways. They happen either as transit or peering interconnections. And this is a term that we're going to use frequently throughout the webinar. So I'd like for us to make sure that there's no confusion around what transit or peering is. Transit is technically a commercial contract between two operators. I give you money, and in exchange for giving you money, you will then connect me to as much of the internet as you know about. And the defining characteristic in transit is that there's usually an exchange of money, and that as a network operator who receives that money, you promise to try to connect your client or your customer to as far as reach of the internet as you can. The alternate model for interconnection, and the model that's been popular for about the past 20 odd years, is peering. And the differentiator between peering is that there's generally no transfer of money. There's fantastic data that we have. If you're interested, you can speak to me after the webinar on how networks interconnect and how 99.98% of networks are sufficient to believe that it's okay to peer or to transfer network traffic and network information with other networks without any kind of legal contract, just on the basis of a handshake. The defining characteristics are that there's no money, and that when you peer with another network, you don't take the information, the network information that you've learned from the peer, and pass it on beyond your network. Now, I want to share a secret with you. For those of you that are not network operators, there's a very common unknown secret about how internet operators make money. There's only 3 ways that traffic can flow in an internet network. So the slide in front of you should show you a sample internet network, network green. A network green has, in this case, 2 customers, or he needs to conduct a transaction between two customers. Both these customers are on Network Green's network. So how does Network Green monetize this? Well, the customer on the left-hand side pays him, so you earn something. The traffic goes through my network as a Network Green, and it gets delivered to my customer on the right-hand side, who's also, by the way, paying me for this convenience. At the end of the day, as the Green network operator, I managed to monetize both connections, and I've earned $2, $2 rupees, whatever it is, but I've earned 2 at the end of the day. Now, this is fantastic. This is a brilliant thing to do if you're a network operator, but fortunately, there is no single network operator that can connect the globe. No single network operator is able to interconnect every single networked device on the internet. So this model is theoretical. What's a more realistic model is that you have a network operator, and somewhere along the line, those network operators both have to connect to some kind of transit network. And for information to flow between you, they will flow through at least one or more than one transit network. The important thing to notice here is not that they're just transit networks, but that the way that the ISP or the network operator monetizes his network is very different. Because here you're still earning money from your customer, and we've represented that as a green dollar. You'll see the earnings coming in. But if I'm going to go to a transit operator, I've got to pay them money to carry my packets across the internet. And of course, no transit operator is going to do this free. So I've got to pay them something. And we've tried to represent the money moving out as a dollar minus in white. At the end of the day, my earnings are going to be whatever I've earned for my customer, less whatever I've got to pay to my transit operator. The third model for getting traffic in or through or around your network is to have a network speaking to another network over an internet exchange point. And when we do that, we earn because we've obviously got our customer that's paying us. But typically at an exchange, we don't pay the network operator on the other side for taking our traffic or for announcing their network prefixes to us or for peering with us. You often hear the term, peering is free, and that's what we talk about. We talk about that when you connect to another network across an exchange, although you might pay a peering port fee or you might pay a fee to host your router in a data center, the actual exchange of traffic is an unmetered transaction. In this instance, our earning is one from our customer that hasn't changed, but because we're not spending money at the internet exchange point, there's no extra spend, there's no extra gain, and so we have one at the end of the day. So we've got 3 situations. A theoretical situation where you could earn 2, a more realistic situation where you earn 1 minus X, where that X depends on some transit value that you've got to negotiate with your transit operator, and you earn 1, which is connecting to an exchange. And if you're a reasonable network operator, if you're a rational network operator, you'll realize that for you to stay in business, or for you to continue to make the most effective use of your business, the best possible thing that you can do is to always try to seek to maximize your peering. Now, of course, this isn't always true. This is true as a general rule, but it's not necessarily true if the cost of getting to an exchange point is prohibitively expensive. And we're going to use that as an edge case for now. I'm aware that we're supposed to talk about exchange points, but it's important to understand the rationale behind this. Why do people want to connect to internet exchange points? What is it that's going to make an exchange successful? And a very key component of that success is understanding what it is that is going to drive the people that are going to be connected to your internet exchange points, the internet service providers, the CDNs, the network operators. What is it that's going to drive them to connect? And a key component of that is this, what we're talking about, this cost minimization. So the network, the internet, has continued to build over the years using this model. We understand now that peering is what we want to do. We understand very quickly why we want to peer, because when we peer, we are minimizing our spend on costly, expensive transit. We're maximizing the gain that we can get for the money that we spend. And over the years, over the past 26 years, exchange points have been around for about that long. The model for interconnecting the model for interconnecting has been to build internet exchange points. Internet exchange points are physical infrastructures. And over time, we've seen different types of technology come and go, but today internet exchange points are typically layer 2 switches. There's really no other workable solution that we have in technology. And those internet exchange points service various needs for us. Of course, they provide the mechanism for us to interconnect. Ethernet is the cheapest form of interconnection that we know of today. They form a natural ecosystem, a natural attraction point for where large content operators can start to deploy internet infrastructure, particularly if they're out of your region and if you're looking to break into your region. Internet exchange points increases autonomy and privacy, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we move on. Across the world today, I pulled this out last night, there are 586 operational internet exchange points across the world. That is operational, that we, the team at PCH, know about. We've been operating the internet exchange point calendar directory, for about 24 years now. And you can see that pretty much most of the developed world has at least one internet exchange point. The darker the country, the more internet exchanges there are in the country. So you can see that the United States has a lot of internet exchanges. They're top of the world, actually. They're about 90, I think. After that is Germany. It doesn't show well on the map because of all the yellow, but Germany and Brazil have about 29, 30 internet exchange points each. Russia, India. But unfortunately, and perhaps the thing that's worth noting, is that there are several places in the world that don't have exchange points. And probably even more poignantly, it's the places in the world that need exchange points, the lesser developed regions of the world, shall we say, that don't have IXPs. So the folks that could potentially benefit the most, unfortunately, don't have them. And hopefully we can work together as a community to try to resolve that. So why do we peer? We started talking about this a little earlier on. The first part is cost reduction, and I explained that very, very quickly. And we used an example earlier, and I'm going to show you a better example as we move forward. We peer to improve performance. Obviously, if you can peer with somebody that is operating in the same geographic location as you, if you can send them your traffic in the same geographic location, it's better than having to go halfway across the world to get into the other network. We peer as an economic tool, and I'll discuss that in detail now. And we peer for national security reasons. And this is becoming more and more of an issue these days. I'm sure everybody on this webinar has heard of Edward Snowden. I'm sure you're aware of some of the revelations that he's made available. So it's no secret now that we should expect our traffic to be able to be expected when they go through other countries. And the only way to make sure that our traffic is really safe, that our traffic isn't available for sniffing by foreign parties, is to be able to is to not have our traffic move through external countries. But we'll talk about that a little later as well. I'm going to try to walk you through a little bit more in detail, but what the internet life cycle is like in a country, at least from the perspective of an internet service provider. So this is how we started our networks. Pretty much all of us started with being an internet service provider. And as an internet service provider, and I have to apologize when I say ISP, the situation is the same if you're an NREN. The situation is the same if you're anything that provisions or sells internet services. I just use ISP because I come from that environment. But if you're an ISP, you typically had one transit provider, and you have a lot of customers. And you sell internet access or internet services to your customers. You collect money from your customers in your local currency, and in exchange, you go to your transit operator, whoever that is, and you say, please connect me to the internet. That's how we started off. That's how pretty much all internet service providers started off. In this model, you're actually not an internet service provider. In this model, what you are is a foreign exchange transaction agent. Because all that you're doing is you're receiving local money, you're running it through the bank, and you're paying out something, usually in dollars or euros. And if you happen to live in a country like mine, I live in South Africa right now, and if your currency has been playing the games that our currency has been playing for the past few years, you'll recognize that as an ISP, there's really no value in you trying to be a foreign exchange agent. You have to try to monetize the S part of that, the service part of that. Now, you can do that in various ways. You can try to host infrastructure. You can try to provide services to your customers. And that's what we need to explore. We need to explore how do we improve this S component? How do we get ourselves out of being just a foreign exchange agent and into a service provider that our clients can come to believe in? The natural progression for that is for you to add a second internet transit provider. And this is normal. The usual way that we think about this as a service provider is we say we want to provide a better level of service to our clients. So we add redundancy into our network. But on top of redundancy, what you're doing, and you're probably not even aware of it, is that you're adding least cost routing to your network. So the redundancy part, I think that's easy. So we don't really need to talk about that unless people want to. And if you do, please pop a question to the management team that's listening in. But let's talk about the least cost routing bit. And I've got a really simple example for you. Let's assume you were the network at the bottom that's labeled U. You had your first transit network. You've been connecting to this transit network to get you connected to the internet. And let's just say that most of your traffic goes to two networks, networks A and networks B. To get to network A, it's 5 network hops away from you. These are random numbers that I made up. And to get to network B, that's 7 network hops via the transit provider that you're trying to get to. Now, a very simplistic understanding of this is that for you to connect to the internet, the average length that the internet's going to be from you is going to be 5 plus 7, which is 12, divided by 2, because we're talking about 2 networks in this case, and that's 6. So the average length for your users to connect to the resources that matter to them on the internet is 6 hops away. But I said that when you added a second transit provider, you started to behave like a least cost router. And that's exactly what happens here. We've added a transit provider green. Transit provider green has 2 parts to the same networks that we're looking to connect to, but the parts are different. Maybe it's because transit provider green is from a different part of the world. Maybe it's because they purchase services from a different place. Maybe they peer in a different place. We don't care too much about it. But what matters is that they're different. Now, the network protocols that drive our use of the internet, the Border Gateway Protocol, or BGP, has an element in it that says choose the shortest number of networks as more preferential. So you'll see that to try to get to network A in this case, we'll make use of transit provider red and send all our packets down that way. But to try to get to network B, instead of sending our traffic through network red as we were a while ago, we're now going to send our traffic to network green because it's a shorter distance. It's a fewer number of network hops away from us. In this case, the now average number of network hops that we have is 5 plus 3, which is 8, divided by still the same number of networks that we're trying to get to, which is 2. So our way for connecting to the internet, the way that the route that we provide for our users to get to the internet has become shorter. It's 4 before it was 6. Now, this is a really simple example, but what I want you to remember is that it illustrates a key important point that underpins interconnections on the internet, that the shorter the number of hops that I need to route to get to a network, the more likely I am, or my network is, going to want to use that path to get to send traffic. We want the route with the shortest number of hops. This should be fairly obvious. Now, before the people that understand BGP on the call say, yes, but there's ways to override this, etc., we're talking about default state routing. And default state routing is shortest number of hops is what I'm going to prefer. Let's go back to our life cycle for a bit and talk a little bit more here. So this has grown. Now we have customers. Customers are now connecting to our internet service provider. We've got our redundant service providers. We've been doing least cost routing, but we now introduce a domestic internet exchange point. When we introduce a domestic internet exchange point, it immediately means that the number of hops that we have to use to get to networks that are in the same country as us or in the same domestic area as us, networks that are connected to the same exchange as us, has dramatically decreased. If there was no internet exchange and all your traffic was going overseas only to come back into your country, now those same networks are exactly one hop away from you. So your network, without having to do anything, is going to start to make use of those, of that single internet exchange point that we have. And that's fantastic because, as you might expect, if we can make use of the internet exchange point that is immediately inside our domestic environment, we have to pay less for transit. When we start paying less for transit, it's less money, less real dollars or euros or pounds, less foreign exchange that has to leave our economy. And for the economists here, or those of you that have studied economics, you will know that that is a positive increase on your balance of payments account. Your balance of payments account is a thing that manages the foreign exchange that comes and goes out of your country. And in short, the less foreign exchange that has to leave, the better it is for you. So your economists, your reserve bank governors, your ministries are really, really going to love you when you introduce a domestic internet exchange point. Not because they understand BGP or they understand anything about how networks interconnect. They're going to love you simply because you've made a positive difference to the country in real economic, in real value terms, money terms. There's very less demand for foreign exchange in your country. It doesn't end there. Once you've installed an internet exchange point in your country, and once the exchange point works and things are working the way you expect it to, your economy starts to grow. And what happens is that the ISP market now becomes an NSP market, a network service provider market. A network service provider market is a market where large, big ISPs start to transport other smaller ISPs across their backbone. And this is like the markets that we see in Europe these days. That market develops from having one internet exchange point, maybe perhaps one exchange in a country, to multiple exchange points in a country across large different cities. And that's a point that we will discuss a little later on. How do we get multiple exchange points into a country? But this is the picture that we want. The picture where we have our market or our economy, if you want to think about that as the cloud, acting as a transport model for a whole bunch of other networks that run underneath us. Now, I've spoken about the money, and that's nice, but most of us on this call are techies, and we want to think about how network works. So I want to continue that abstraction and speak very briefly about how real network traffic moves across the network. Now, again, this is a simplified example, but the concepts are really, really important. And I want you to tie those concepts into some of the things that we're going to talk about later. We have two networks, again, network red and network green. And in this example, network red and network green each have an internet exchange point that is close to them. Let's assume that something had to happen. There was a transaction that had to happen on the internet, and the red customer wanted to speak to the green customer. How would the actual network packets flow? Well, the red network customer sends his request to the red ISP. I am paying you. He goes to the ISP and says, I am paying you money. Please, can you deliver this packet for me to, well, whoever the green customer is going to be. The red ISP takes the packet, looks at the destination, and says, you're destined for the green network. I know two ways to get to the green network. I can get to IXP1, which is on the left-hand side, or I can send the traffic all the way down to IXP2, which is way down on my right-hand side. It's a much longer path away from me. I've got to make a routing decision inside my network. The decision that the red network makes is actually a really interesting decision. You might think that it's making a decision based on performance, but it's not. The red network, I guess like all of us, they're selfish. They want to push their own self-interest. The IXP1 is closer to it. And because it's closer to it, it's a Shorter distance, less fiber, cheaper path. So the red network sends traffic to IXP1, which is closer to it. The green network picks up this traffic, recognizes that it's for a customer, or its own customer, recognizes that it's got a peering relationship with network red. So if I've got a peering relationship with them and the traffic's for my network, my clients, I've got to deliver it. So the green network picks up the traffic at IXP1. It backhauls it, what appears to be quite a distance away from IXP1 into its network, and it delivers the packet to its customer. Now, if this was the end of that internet transaction, what it would seem like is that the red network had to buy just a little bit of fiber or some kind of microwave or some kind of transport to get to the exchange. But the green network had to buy a whole lot more. And that doesn't really look fair to us, at least if you look at it in the model that it is on the slide. But internet transactions don't work that way. We work on the model of data send, data receive. So once part of that traffic has gone back to the green network customer has to reply. And as replying, the green customer sends his packets into the green network. The green network now is faced with the same decision that the red network was faced with just a short time ago. Do I send my traffic all the way on the long path? Because that's where I received it. So it kind of does make sense for me to send it that way. Or do I send it to the internet exchange point, to the exchange that is closer to me? And he makes the same decision that the red service provider made a short time ago. He says, let me minimize my spend. So this is going to be the shorter fiber. I'm going to send my traffic to IXP2. Because the red network appears at IXP2, the red network picks up that traffic and delivers it to their customer. And that is how data gets delivered across the internet. We have a term for it in networking terms. We call it hot potato routing, but that's literally the model for how internet traffic gets passed between internet service providers. Now, the fascinating thing about this is that in this network transaction, the red network earns some money from its customers, and it uses that money, that revenue, to build and extend its network. Building and extending its network means it improves the type of connection it has to its customer. Maybe it was DSL and that's upgraded to fiber. It improves the places that it interconnects to. Maybe it added a second or third transit provider. Maybe it built to a second or third internet exchange point. But it's money that has come into the red network, and the red network has decided to invest that in a way that the red network sees fit. The green network does exactly the same thing. They receive revenue, and they invest that revenue in a way that makes sense for them. The green network has its money and costs. The red network has its own money and costs. But what we end up with at the end of the day is a symmetry. There's a fair sharing of costs that goes between the networks that interconnect. And this is important because this is very, very different to the voice network that some people know about or that some people might be working on today, which doesn't apply its revenue in this way. Talking about that is a little out of scope. I don't want to talk about that. But what's, I think, important for us is as internet network engineers, we understand that we get this fair symmetric cost sharing, which doesn't exist in the voice world. Sorry. The efficiency of the internet depends on this very, very simple principle, okay? That for two parties who want to change traffic in a way that is fair and equal to them, there's got to be an internet exchange point that is close by both of them. Perhaps a different way of saying this, the corollary to this, as I call it, is that if you belong to a city, a country, or an economy that does not yet have an internet exchange point, you're disadvantaging yourself because all that you're doing is you're exporting capital across a border, across a boundary, across a state line, across anywhere else. You're taking money from your economy and sending it out. And here's what I mean by this. Remember the hot potato routing example? Imagine if IXP2 had to completely disappear, and there was only one IXP where both of these internet operators connected. And because only IXP1 was in operation, the red network, which is very close to IXP1, is always going to get the benefit of this transaction. They're always going to pay the shorter path of the fiber to connect to the exchange. And the green network is always going to pay the long distance cost. Of course, they're both benefiting because they're getting traffic shared across the internet exchange. But what's not fair in this example is that there's no equitable sharing of the transmission or transport costs that are required to make this work. I want to pause here for a minute, and I want you to think about where you are, wherever you are in the world, wherever you're connecting from. Think about your economy, and think about what it costs to put something like a virtual machine. This is the rage today. Everybody wants their own VPS server. But think of what it costs to host and build a VPS server in your country. Can you get a VPS server for, I think it's $3 or $4? That's the rate these days that you would pay if you had to connect to Amsterdam or Frankfurt or any of the places in the world that have these huge internet exchange points. Are the companies that sell you these services on par? Are they competitive with the VPS providers that come out of places where there are these giant internet exchange points? If I had to ask you yes or no, I'm sure that the answer that most of you are going to be polling back is going to be no. No, we can't get it for $3 to $4. Maybe we can do it for $7 or $8 or $9 or $10, but definitely not that $3 to $4 or whatever the cost is going to be. And there's a really simple way of explaining that. Because when you think about where these giant internet exchanges are, and then you think about the companies that are trying to provide you internet services, and I'm not necessarily talking about the hyperscalers, the Amazons, the Googles, Microsofts, etc. I'm talking about a regular business. Talk about a regular business connecting to the internet exchange in Amsterdam or the internet exchange in Frankfurt. They can do VPSs for $3. Because simply by connecting to the internet exchange that is in their their backyard, simply by doing that, they're able to see a significantly larger portion of the world. They're able to see many, many, many more ISPs than you or I could connecting to the internet exchanges that are in our backgrounds. And that's what we need to improve. That's the goal that I want you to see here. That we need to be in a way where we can try to get more and more of those networks to try to connect and peer in our environment. The goal to doing that, or the starting point to doing any of that, is to make sure that we at least have an exchange in our local vicinity. Now you can argue this, I'm just using Amsterdam and Frankfurt as examples, but you could argue this from your own cities, your own state's perspective. I live in South Africa. The Johannesburg Internet Exchange Point has been operational since 1996. And you think that's fantastic. You guys, you were really early. You did well. Well done. Well done. But we don't just have one exchange point. In my country, we have 6. We have exchange points in 2 exchange points each in the 3 largest cities. And then a common question I get all the time, and then we'll do this in the Q&A, I guess, is why do you have exchange points in the other cities? Well, it's the same principle. If we didn't build an exchange in Cape Town, which is 1,300 kilometers away, then the ISPs in Cape Town would always be paying backhaul back to a city that's 1,300 kilometers away just to change traffic. And that's not fair. So the model that you want to see build, the model that you want to develop inside your economy, inside your country, inside whatever part of the world you're responsible for, is to have at least working active internet exchange points in every area where there's commerce, where there's people, where there's telecommunications infrastructure, and where people are using those telecommunications infrastructure, building interconnects, transacting online. Ultimately, I want to see a world where there are internet exchange points in probably every single city. Hopefully, that's going to be what we get to. If you learn nothing else out of this webinar that we have, please remember this very, very simple formula. Speed times distance equals cost. None of us live in a world where our customers want slower internet access. I've yet to go into a place where someone says, I'm actually okay, you can take my gigabit link and drop it to 1 megabit, or take my 10 meg link and drop it to 1 megabit. All of our customers, all of us want more speed. If we want more speed, we should be willing to pay cost. But of course, nobody wants to pay more than what they're paying right now, right? So this is the dilemma. The dilemma is, how do I make things faster, but at the same time, how do I consistently make things cheaper? This is a problem we're all faced with. And the only other variable we have to play with is distance. So if we are always driving up speed, if we're always driving down cost, it should be very clear to you that we need to drive down the distance that we need to get to the content, to get to whatever transaction needs to be happening on the remote network side. And hopefully we'll discover some strategies to do that now. So remember, our goal is we want to get to this kind of an environment. We want to get to an environment where we have redundant transit providers in our ecosystem, where we are a network, or we operate networks, or our economy has networks that runs lots and lots of network service providers. The network service providers are servicing ISPs, tons, maybe dozens of ISPs under them. We have multiple internet exchange points running in our ecosystem. And where the transit market, that market where we were just acting as agents for foreign exchange, where that has been replaced. And instead of selling transit into and out of our region, we are now selling transport across the region. There's an important distinction here because transport enables the building of other infrastructure. And we'll talk about that in a bit. So I'm going to pause for now and check with the team if there are any questions so far. Stephen?
Hello. So we are going to launch a poll for the participants. Right now we have no question. If anyone has a question, please type in the Q&A or in the chat. We are sending out a poll. So, Nishal, hold on. We have a poll. If you see the poll on the screen, please try and provide an answer. What do you think are the top reasons people in your community peer? Okay, we are having participation. 43, 44, 46 seconds. Few seconds left. Okay, we are going to end the poll right now and share. Only 51% participated. So we are sharing the results with you. And Nishal, you want to comment these results?
Okay, so the results that I see say 94% of you think that it's cost reduction, and that's a very good point. I'm glad to see that is at the top. And I'll tell you why when I start talking again. Improving performance, boost economy, that I'm very sad about. But I got to say that 42% that I see where you say boost economy, not consistent with a lot of the training workshops that we do, particularly in the African region, where a lot of the networks actually don't understand that peering is not just the interconnection of networks. It's actually an investment in your local infrastructure. It's an investment in your country's economy. And that's something that we've been trying to explain to national security people across the world, actually. Enhanced national security, I'm happy to see that you're all seeing that as a positive benefit. I got to say, I don't really understand NAT or the V4 lifespan. I don't think that those really make a difference when it comes to peering. And maybe when we get into at the end, we can have a more interactive Q&A around what that means, the reduced lifespan and IPv4 NAT. Great. So let's move on.
A question for you, Nishal. How to set a good peering pricing?
Let's get to the pricing bits a little bit in a second. I think we're gonna get to that part now. We will talk about what's important in terms of cost. I don't want to detract from what I expected us to talk about.
Okay. So next
question. So right now,
sorry,
go on.
Yeah. Another question is, I got a bit concerned when you said it is not wise to have an IXP 13 miles away. Why? If this is still within the long haul.
Sorry, when I said it's not wise to have an internet exchange, that is?
That is, you said it's not wise to have an internet exchange point 13 miles away.
I don't think I said that. Did I? I said you should not have, so what you're aiming for really is to have an internet exchange that is close to you, an internet exchange that is in your domestic economy, right? I think that's fairly easy to understand. And what you want, or what you will see develop over time, is that as your economy grows, as your economy develops, as more and more people start to grow, it's probably not a bad idea at that stage to have a second internet exchange in your economy. But let's talk about that, Stephen, if you want to make a note of the question, let's talk about that a little later down. When we'll talk a little bit more about what are the right number of internet exchange points to have in a city.
Okay.
Are there more questions?
No, the other question is how to set prices. Okay, I have another question.
So we'll come to those then.
What are the lists of African operators with our IXPs? Without, okay. What are the list of African operators without IXPs? Okay.
So if you go to the PCH website, and that's www.pch.net/IXP/dir, you can get the map that I showed you a little earlier on, and that will show you where all exchange points that we, the PCH team, that we know about exist in the world. Now, some of these are exchanges that are no longer operational. So if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, there's a little filter button, and you can choose, for example, status is active, and that will show you all the active internet exchange points. If for example, you're a researcher and you want to see all exchange points that are no longer active, you can say status is inactive, of course. It will show you the inactive or exchanges that haven't survived over the years.
Is there any model for connecting IXPs across the world? If there is.
Let's get that after we go to the next part. Okay?
Okay. All right.
So the rough graph that you see in front of you is my interpretation of what the internet has looked like over the past 30 years. That means from 1989 up to now, every roughly 11 months or so, the internet doubles in size. It doubles in terms of the amount of traffic that's moving across the internet. And if you think about a network that is growing phenomenally like this, okay, there's no way that you can continue to go to your bosses. There's no way you can continue to go to your directors and say, hi, our network is doubling in size. We therefore need to buy exactly twice the amount of transit that we had last year so that we can continue to provide these services to our clients. That's not going to work. The way that we try to reduce the spending, the costs that we have, as I showed you, the first way that we try to do it is we try to do it by finding cheaper ways for us to get traffic routed. And in our case, the one quite simpler, cheaper way to get traffic routed is for us to be able to connect to an internet exchange and to hand off traffic at that internet exchange point. So if we hope to build a network that's going to beat this model, we have to find a simpler way to run our network. we have a tool, or we have a way of thinking inside PCH. We call it the virtuous cycle of upgrades, because there's many things that we have to think about when we talk about how do we scale and how do we build things that are going to last us for the next 11 months, right? For the next 11 months, the next 2 years. One of the things, just one of them, is internet exchange points. What I mean by internet exchange points is that we should expect that the traffic that we see at the internet exchange point next year is going to be twice the traffic that we're seeing now. And it's not so much the traffic that's important, but for example, is the infrastructure at the exchange important? Are the people supporting it, are they aware of this and have they provisioned to be able to scale? Have I provisioned my backbone to be able to deal with twice the amount of traffic going to the internet exchange? Have I put in the right routing techniques in my network to make sure that as the traffic in my network doubles, most of that doubling is being sent off to the internet exchange point? A very common statistic I hear from a lot of ISPs in my country is that at least 60 to 70% of their traffic is able to go across the internet exchange points. I apologize, I should have mentioned at the start, not only do I work at PCH, but I also run 3 internet exchange points in South Africa. So I have a good view into what happens in peering in my country and even across Africa because of other work that I do. So what I was talking about, 60 to 70% of traffic being delivered across an internet exchange, that's extremely, extremely common, particularly if the exchange has the 4 horsemen, the horsemen of the apocalypse, as we call them, the large content networks, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Apple or Akamai, et cetera, if they're at your internet exchange, then it's very, very realistic that those numbers are going to be there. But how are you dealing with that, and how are you building what has been provisioned inside your network for that 11-month cycle when traffic is going to double? And then when we think about the internet exchange point, the internet exchange point is actually something that's really, really simple. It's this layer 2 construct. Do we have, if we're going to be doubling all this bandwidth, or we expect to be doubling this bandwidth, do we have local loops set and run openly inside our country? I live in South Africa. I mentioned that already. And a lot of people ask me, they say that you guys have been growing fantastically since 2010, 2011 onwards. But what happened during 2000 and 2011? And it's a good question. It's a good question because although we had peering nailed in the 1990s, in the last century, from that 2000 to 2010-ish period, we had no real investment in local loop connectivity. So although we had a lot of the elements in place, what we did not have was a way to be able to get fast connectivity to people. Now FTTH is rolling out, DSL is very common in a lot of places, so it's easy to see what's happening because people have faster speeds of getting to the internet. They want to consume more. As they consume more, well, that leads to the doubling of infrastructure as we spoke of that happens. So if you're thinking about your environment, you're thinking about your ecosystem, you've thought about your connections to the internet exchange, have you thought about local loops to your clients? That's an important part. Of course, the next part of that is, do I have a national backbone, or is there a national backbone that I can leverage off? Is the national backbone open? Is it free? Is it cheap and easy to use? And I can think of many, many countries that did not realize that this was such a criteria, such an important criteria for them to start to build, particularly the East African countries. When CCOM landed for the first time in 2009 on the east coast of Africa, they were very, very happy because the coastal regions now had access to fiber. So if you're a coastal city, that was fantastic. But if you're not a coastal city, what happened to the cities inland? There was no real competitive fiber between, at that time, say Nairobi and Mombasa, if you're Kenyan, or even further on, going on beyond that. And it took a while for that infrastructure to be installed, for that infrastructure to become cost feasible. And only when it became cost feasible did we start seeing growth happening. I'm using Kenya as an example. I could have said the same thing about South Africa, by the way. I know my country's defects way too well. We had exactly the same problem, a lack of national competitive operators who are willing to sell us fiber at national backbone levels. International cables, I think this is also going without saying. If you're constrained by growth because there's only one international submarine cable that is touching your network, if there's only one operator that has landing rights, if there's only one operator that has landing rights to satellites, we've all lived through those environments. We've all lived through those monopolies. We shouldn't necessarily want to see them. So we need to have international submarine cables that are available openly for everyone to use. In the same way, for your economy to grow, we need to have critical infrastructure elements inside your community. And the critical infrastructure elements are going to be the usual things that we'd expect. We'd expect to see DNS root servers. We'd expect to see CCTLDs housed inside your economy. If you're South African, if you're Kenyan, do you have .ke and .za inside your country? And then, do you have the other CCTLDs, the people that you want to do business with, do you have those inside your country as well? Okay, so that's the second part of it. But aside from critical infrastructure being just DNS, which I referred to, there's also got to be a way for you to have better and faster, larger data centers. There's got to be a way for law enforcement to be able to react to any attacks that occur to keep your digital economy safe as well. And of course, through all of this, we've got to have the right policy and regulatory framework in place. Now, I won't talk too much about this here. This is not a webinar for policy folk, but this doesn't mean that we need to double our regulatory environment. It just means that we have to have a regulatory environment that can scale. And by the way, once you're done with all of this, you're going to start again, because by the time you've gone through the circle, it's time to go through thinking about upgrading your connection to the exchange or upgrading your infrastructure at the internet exchange, etc. This is a simplified circle. I've only put 6 of the elements in here, but there's a better picture of some of the different items that we as PCH, we feel that you should be looking at or should exist inside your environment to be able to scale and to keep up with that doubling of infrastructure every 2 months. I think this is the next pause where we take questions. So have there been any new questions, Stephen?
Nishal, thank you again. And we are going to send out a second poll before taking the questions. And yeah, so okay. So the poll is live. So you have many questions. If you have an internet exchange point in your community, does it arrange? Yeah, good. 3% voters. 30 seconds left. Okay. %30 voters and 13 seconds left. We need more voters. Okay, so it is 29 out of 58. We are going to stop and share the results of the poll. Okay, we are sharing the results. Nishal, you want to comment?
Okay, so if you have an IX in your community, does it arrange? And I can't see the rest of the question, but I'm assuming it meant, does it arrange meetups and hookups? Most of you seem to say yes, 25 of you. That's fantastic. And we'll talk about the value of that in a second. Do you have training days to promote best practices. So this is disconcerting. 55% of you are saying that you don't have enough engagement. I'm reading this as you don't have enough engagement from the exchange in your environment. Talk about networking best practices. And that's something that we can definitely work with your internet exchange points to help resolve. I mean, to me, it's really simple. Right? We're ever growing, we're ever increasing our interconnected world. Why is it that the exchanges as centralized organizations, why can we not leverage these exchange points to try to provide best practices using folks like PCH, using folks like AFRINIC that are here as well, to be able to get people to understand these are the things that you need to be able to do to run your network and to run your network effectively. And I'm glad to see that there's an increase in the number of meetups and peers. So we'll talk about that in the next part, which I think is the important bit. So to contextualize this, we've spoken about the need to peer from a service provider's perspective. We've spoken about it from a national layer perspective. There's elements that are needed inside your economy. Of course, one of those elements is internet exchange points. We're now going to go specifically talk about exchanges. I realize that this has been a long introduction to get us to where we want to be, which is to talk about exchange points. But it's important to realize that you can't start talking about exchange points if you don't see exchange points as just one cog in the wheel. And that's a big problem, that people see exchange points as a silver bullet to fixing a lot of issues, but they're not. Exchange does just one thing, and that exchange promotes peering, right? So let's talk about the elements that you need to worry about. And I tried to make a lotus flower. I hope that came out. I hope you can see the lotus flower in all of that. I apologize if it's not clear. But my lotus flower picture of what you should be considering when you're thinking about an exchange are these 5 elements that you should be thinking about. And this is not in any order other than what I wrote down. But you should be thinking about the governance model for the exchange. You should be thinking about location, some kind of sustainability, growth, and community. If I had to think of the 5 things that I would want you to immediately recognize are important to internet exchange points, it would be these 5. And let's talk about them for a second. I chose to put in one slide about all of these because I didn't want this to feel like it was death by PowerPoint, but also because talking about all of the different models and building slides about all of them is probably not as helpful. There are many ways you can run an exchange. There are many different governance models. The governance model, one of the governance models is that the exchange is built and run by a university. The exchange is built and run by an Internet Service Providers Association. And I picked those 2 primarily because this is AFRINIC's webinar. And in Africa, most internet exchanges, when they started out either via some kind of service providers agency or via a university initiative. Okay, so in the early 2000s, the ISPs, from I think the ISP associations in the 1990s, 96, 97, started up 2 exchanges in South Africa. After that, it was the loose grouping of the Service Providers Association that started off an exchange in Kenya, and then in Uganda, and then in Tanzania. And that's been the way for building things as we moved on. Recently, particularly in Africa, we're seeing a lot more internet exchanges being built or being run by government agencies. Those government agencies are typically the regulator, or they could be a form of the government, some part of a national information center, or something like that. I didn't make slides about all of these because I don't believe that in the model for how the internet is growing in Africa, and again, I'm referring to Africa because this is an AFRINIC webinar, I don't believe that that's the model that's going to best suit most of the African countries. And the reason is really simple. When you think about an internet exchange point, the first thing that you want is trust. The first thing you want is trust, because an exchange point is a shared environment. And when you tell an operator of any kind that he is in a shared collaborative environment with his competitors, the first thing they want is, well, how do I know that my competitor is not going to try to do something stupid to damage my business? And the way that you fix that problem is through trust. You trust that the people that are going to run your internet exchange know what they're doing. You trust that the people that are going to run your exchange act in the right manner. You trust, as an operator, that there's nothing bad that's going to come out of you connecting to that internet exchange point, right? Models for trust are very different. In some places, people are happy to trust the government. It's true, believe it or not. In some places, in most places, people are happier, I should say, to trust individuals that they believe are going to service a community kind of benefit role for them. And at least that's the model that has seen, and that's the model that has grown a lot of exchange points across the world. And this is the model that is most common with the internet exchange points across the world today. The model of some kind of community, non-profit run internet exchange point. And there's some very important concepts here. Firstly, because it's community, it's the people that are sitting and doing the same thing that you were doing. And you could be one of those people because you're a member of the community. So this issue about, well, I don't know if I trust them to do this, and I don't know if they're going to act, that completely disappears. Because the minute you stand up to say, I don't trust my competitor to run this, you could be volunteering to do the same thing. Remember, it's community, right? Nonprofits. And before I jump to nonprofits, and this community part is a big part of how the exchange is run. So a lot of internet exchange points have volunteers from inside the peering community, from inside the networking community, that dedicate their time to making sure that the internet exchange point stays up and stays stable. And you might think that this really doesn't make sense, but stop for a minute and think. The people that are the most invested in the internet exchange being operational are the people that are peered at the internet exchange point. So if I'm a peer at the IX, of course I want to make sure the IX is running, because if the IX is running, it means my business is going to be running more effectively. And what can I do to make sure that the IX is running well? I could lend them my skills. Perhaps I'm a skilled BGP engineer. Perhaps I'm fantastic at debugging hardware problems. Perhaps I've got fiber that I can lend them, etc., etc., etc. The point is that finding individuals, finding excited volunteers, as I call them, from within your community will always mean that you have people that are going to do the best for that internet exchange because they see the value of it. And these are not just words, by the way. I'm not just making stuff up when I'm telling you this. There are a lot of large internet exchange points. The internet exchange in Johannesburg, the Jinx, is run largely by volunteers. I'm one of them. There are at least four or five others, and they keep things, and we keep things running. And when you might say, well, this is Joburg, we're Africa, we're tiny. There's 6 in Seattle. It's one of the largest exchange points in the world, completely volunteer driven. So there's a really good model for saying we can run exchanges as volunteer community nonprofit internet exchange points. But let's talk about the nonprofit for a bit. And this is particularly important because no matter how good or how well the intent is of the people that are running the exchange today, you don't know what that's going to be like in the future. We don't. None of us have a crystal ball. Nonprofit is important because in a lot of countries, nonprofits are protected. A nonprofit cannot be bought or sold. And because you are protected, you don't have to worry about somebody saying, I'm going to buy out your business and I'm going to convert your business from being a nonprofit internet exchange into a for-profit internet exchange that's just then going to line my pockets and make me rich. This is important because this has happened in several places across the world. Internet exchange points that were run for the good of the community were morphed, turned over, and become profit centers for a telco or for particular individuals, etc. So making sure that the exchange is a non-profit in whatever variant that exists in your environment, that's an important thing to think about. Okay, non-profits don't have to act to maximize revenue for shareholders. which is another important thing. That as a nonprofit, you always want to make sure you have your business running, but you're not trying to maximize money for your shareholders. You're not trying to extract rent from the people that are appearing at your exchange. Somebody asked about costs, and we'll talk about costs still, but it's important that when you set, if you have to set costs to run your exchange, that these are as low as possible. So more on governance, sorry, before I clicked accidentally. So we talked about trust. The one thing that is true is this, that even if everybody in your country trusts your government, people outside of your country probably don't trust your government. And I don't mean that in any disparaging way to any government. It's just, imagine if I was an international content developer and I was looking for a place to go and house my content. Do you think that I would be more comfortable bringing my content to house it inside a commercial data center in your country, i.e. somebody that's running a business and I can enter a contract with, and that contract specifies how I can call them, when I can call them, and what I can get done, versus coming and bringing my content and putting it at a data center that is owned by your government, which is where the internet exchange point is. There's a good example for this. I don't know if there's anybody from Mauritius online, except the AFRINIC team. But in Mauritius, the exchange point used to be at, or still is largely, at the government data center. And while it's been fantastic from an uptime perspective, it has meant that when people needed to do work out of working hours, it becomes really difficult. And that's a key thing, because if your data center is closed to the public after 4 o'clock every day, then how do networks start to do maintenance? Because the ISPs on the call, maintenance windows are from 2 to 5 a.m. That's all. We can't make changes anytime out of that. Now, housing an internet exchange point inside a government data center might seem fantastic because it might seem to be the neutral option, but it doesn't sound so great when it thinks about, well, where we're going to be hosting things. So governance covers a lot of things. Sorry, I leapt into location there for a bit. I apologize, but it's also the issue about governance and government being the governance agency also comes down to trust. I want to make sure as an operator that the exchanges that I go to are open. I want to make sure that the exchanges that I go to are run by the community, because even though I'm not in that community, I'm willing to accept a decision that the community might make that is better for the community, rather than 1 or 2 people or the government say, this is how this should be, and there you go, this is how it's going to be. So the model that we try to promote for internet exchange points is always the community nonprofit model. We don't believe that exchange points should have fees, but I'll talk about that in a second. I started talking about location. I apologize, I jumped ahead. I mentioned why the government data center, for example, was bad. But that's equally true for a lot of other things. Another story from Africa is the Liberia Internet Exchange is inside the cable landing system. And the cable landing system is a great place, obviously fantastic uptime, but the cable landing system won't allow people that are not part of the cable landing system consortium to connect to the internet exchange point. So when you start to do things like that, when you start to limit who can get to the internet exchange, your internet exchange is not going to grow. And if your internet exchange does not grow, then you start to lose out on the potential for you to hand over traffic, your domestic operators to hand over traffic to the foreign networks that you want to connect to your country. So there's 2 parts. The first is exchange is obviously for your local participants. We'll talk about that in a bit. But remember, you always want to have foreign networks connecting, because the minute the foreign networks come and peer inside your country, then that long arm that we saw earlier on, where you have to pay, your networks have to pay long distances to get to London, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, that disappears. So our location should be open. Neutrality is best, if possible. Not every country has carrier neutral data centers. And the way that I describe this is always that even if you don't have a carrier neutral data center, there's nothing that says that the part of the exchange that is in the data center that you are in cannot be declared carrier neutral. I'll use the example of Johannesburg. The exchange in Johannesburg started in '96. People weren't talking about carrier neutral data centers then. But what happened was the agreement that the host had with the other operators was that they could bring their own connections, regardless of how it was provided. They could bring their own connections into the area that was stipulated as being the area for the internet exchange point. So the big data center around it probably wasn't carrier neutral at the time, but that part that serviced the internet exchange, that was absolutely carrier neutral. That's what you could push for. And that's the model that we generally try to get people to think about if there are no carrier neutral data centers. How to create this little oasis that is carrier neutral. The wrong approach is to say, well, we don't have a carrier neutral data center, so let's build a carrier neutral data center. And after we build a carrier neutral data center, we will then think about putting in an internet exchange point. That's absolutely the wrong way to do it. Because yes, it's fantastic, you're going to have a carrier neutral data center. But if you're relying on the data center to fund the build of the, if you're relying on the exchange point to fund the build of the data center, it's not going to work that way. A really good example is Bahrain. Let me step out of Africa for a second. There's a fantastic data center in Bahrain, all the things that you could possibly wish for, spent no expense building this. And after the exchange, after the data center went in, somebody decided, okay, here's the internet exchange, these cabinets, it's going to be here, here's the switch. Oh, I've spent lots of millions of dollars on the data center, so now my exchange point fee needs to be really, really high, because if the exchange point fee is not high, I can't recoup my costs that I spent on the data center. And guess what happened? Well, you don't need to think too much about what happened. The exchange didn't take off. So don't try and spend money, or don't overcapitalize is what we always say, because if you try to overcapitalize at the start, the exchange isn't going to be able to support that. One of the key goals of peering, and I say this all the time, is to reduce the cost of running your network. The operator, and this is why we started talking about why operators peer. Operators peer to reduce their costs. So if you're going to leverage high costs at your internet exchange point, that's going to discourage operators from connecting. Okay, expensive internet exchange points do not succeed. Other things that you want to think about in your data center, well, as your exchange point grows, one of the things that's going to grow the exchange is the addition of an external content network. So it's really, really useful to be able to have room to grow. Of course, if you're starting an exchange, it's something that you will put down and you'll think about, and you'll say, well, maybe I'll be thinking about this in 2 years' time. But don't put down infrastructure in a facility where you know in 2 years' time it's not going to be possible to grow. That's going to be a really, really, really difficult thing to manage. Now, sustainability has become a big thing in our region. Sustainability is, how do I make sure that the exchange continues to run? And unfortunately, when we think about sustainability, a very common thing that people tie to sustainability is fees. How do I make an exchange work? What does it take? What are the fees that I should be putting in? How many staff do I need, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll give you the South African example. Today at Jinx, we have about 230 odd peers, I think. We have 4 volunteers and 1 half-day employee. So we manage 230 networks across 4 different locations. Actually, it's more than that because we also have data exchanges in Cape Town and Durban. So there's 4 plus 3 plus 2. That's 9 sites were overall with half-day FTE. We're able to do that. Sorry, that's full-time employee. We're able to do that because we have volunteers from the community. Because we have volunteers from the community and because we're able to do that, we're able to make sure that the cost for connecting to the internet exchanges are kept relatively low. This is the key thing. Yes, there's a port charge that you need to use when you connect to the Johannesburg exchange, but for those of you starting off exchange points, if you're starting off exchange points and you're thinking about costs, let me stop you right now. You're doing the wrong thing. Why would somebody necessarily want to pay you for getting connected to an exchange when if it's going to be a startup exchange, there's nothing in there? So the question is, how do I get this working? You've talked to us about exchange points. You've told us about the fantastic value we can get, but I need money. I need something to get this moving. Well, there are lots of ways that you can help to, lots of things that you can do to help constrain your costs at the start. For example, there are lots of organizations that will make donations to you. At PCH, we're happy to send you switching gear if you're going to run a non-profit internet exchange point. So if there's no exchange in your community and you think, I can make this work, and you've got a good idea, then you can write to us. The email address is at the end. But write to us, and someone from our outreach team will be able to talk to you and work with you around how we can get you kit switches to keep exchange free. I believe, is still donating servers, but even if they aren't, there are people in your community that you should be able to leverage. You should be able to sit down and talk to your community and say, these are the things that we want out of the domestic internet exchange point. We want the reduction in costs. We want the speed. We want the security. We want all of these things, and we can't do it without your help. I got interested in internet exchange points in 97, I think, because the team that I was working in, I used to work at an ISP. The team that I was working in was the team that was designated to be responsible for the internet exchange point. The internet exchange point was in a corner of our data center, and we were the guys that were supposed to be making sure that it worked. Now, again, most of you are techies on this call, so let's talk about what making it work means. It means making sure that there's power to the switch all the time. Fine. Switch, the internet exchange needs power, no problem. Making sure that every time somebody connected to the internet exchange point, they had a unique port. Now, this is not terribly difficult. It's actually really, really difficult to put two cables into the same port. So keeping track of which ports were open and which ports were not open, not a big thing to do. And the third critical thing that we needed to do when we were running the exchange was to make sure that we allocated a unique address to every single participant that came in. Again, not a very difficult thing. So to those people that are saying, well, we're going to start exchange and we're going to need 5 or 6 people to run this internet exchange point, my first question to you is, what are these people going to be doing with all of their time? Because if you're going to have 5 people that you need to pay salaried workers to run an exchange, there's not much to do. You're not connecting peers on a daily basis. You're not connecting peers on even a weekly basis in most places. It's trivial to find interested volunteers in your community, even if they're not directly in your community, as in they might be in a different city, but they can still volunteer to help. They can volunteer to write documentation. They can volunteer to keep your paperwork online, etc., etc. It's still trivial to find these kinds of people to help you run your exchange point at 0 salary level while you're starting. And that's your goal. Your goal is always, how do I reduce the average per bit delivery cost to the network that wants to get connected to my internet exchange point? Because if you make it expensive, and I apologize, I'm saying this all the time, but I do want it to sink in. If you make it expensive for people to connect to your internet exchange point, people are not going to connect. They really are not. So my goal, my answer for sustainability is look to your community. Look to the nations and look to your community. And there are naysayers that will say that this does not scale. I challenge any of you to tell me it doesn't. Because I have yet to see a situation where a community that is working together and that is happily cooperating to run an exchange, not step up to see the exchange through any kind of problem. Exchange points are becoming increasingly sexier, I should say, in the internet world today. There are a lot of people that are putting more and more attention to this. And a lot of those people are government folk. And a lot of the exchange points that are going in now, particularly in Africa, exchange points that are being mandated, that are being told, well, you should make this work exchange points that are being told, well, you should make this work. We're going to build it for you. And after we've built it for you, you should all just connect and it's going to work. This field of dreams approach, the build it and they will come model, does not work for internet exchange points. Okay, it's very simple. An internet exchange, if you just put something down without having done the work, and you think, well, now that it's there, people are happily going to peer, that's not going to happen. The effort in building an exchange point, the work in building an exchange point comes not from people peering at the exchange necessarily. It comes from working with your community to get the people that are operating networks in your community to understand the value of the internet exchange point. So the 5 elements that I've written out at the front, arguably, and I certainly feel this, and I can say this on behalf of all of us at PCH, we firmly believe that the strongest element that's going to determine whether or not your exchange is going to succeed when you're starting up is going to be your community. If you cannot have people inside your community step up to say, yes, we're willing to do things. We're willing to support you build. We trust in what you're doing. We're willing to peer. We're willing to help you run things. If that trust doesn't exist, your exchange is not going to grow. If your exchange does not grow for local participants, if you build an exchange and you cannot attract the local network operators to the exchange, don't think the CDNs are going to come. And that's another problem that we see now. That people are building exchange points and they're thinking, well, I've got this exchange. Now I want Google or Akamai or Microsoft or Amazon to come and peer at my exchange. The thing that's going to make it worth their while is if you've built an exchange, if people from your community are peering at that exchange. And sorry, when I say people from your community, I mean the network operators. If your internet society, if your internet community is happily connected to the exchange and transferring traffic, that's the element at which the CDNs are going to say, this is now worth our time, because we have a single location that people can now connect to. Unfortunately, and I know it's tempting for a lot of people to say, well, there's no traffic, there's no content, there's really very little reason in us needing to build an internet exchange point. We all are sending email via Gmail, we're sending mail via Yahoo. So what's the value of the exchange for us? And this is where you need to take a long, hard look at yourself and say, what are you willing to invest in? And my suggestion, my advice is always invest wisely. I've already said that no internet exchange succeeds without a community. So get your community together and start them to understand the value. Start to get them to understand the point of seeing that if they continue to support services that use bits that are out of your country, instead of using bits that are in your country, you are not promoting the use and the growth of the internet inside your community. A good friend of mine always says, I don't want to get my packets wet. And that's his line for saying, I don't want my packets to use submarine fiber or to leave my country. That's an important component. What services are my users using that are not in my country? Why are they using those services? What exists? Is it because we can't build those services? If you can't build those services, you're telling me you can't run an exchange point, because it's really not that difficult anymore. It really isn't. It's not that difficult to build infrastructure. It's not that difficult to build a pay service. It's not that difficult to build a virtual hosting service or a VM environment. Maybe 25 years ago, yes, because people had pockets of knowledge that were kept inside silos inside their organization. But that's not how the world works today. Today, pretty much everything's on GitHub or SourceForge or one of these other sites that you can quickly see, oh, this is how Amazon scaled this, or this is how Netflix built that. Great, I can find a smart techie in my community and we can work to try to build the same thing. So find a business case for your community, find something that can make it work for your community, and build your exchange for your community. So these are the questions that I had put down. I had said, if you have an exchange in your community, does it respond with training dates? Does it do best practice? Does it do meetups? Because I think all of these things are important. People tell me that I don't understand this, that I'm from South Africa and that South Africa is very different to the rest of Africa, and that's why. And I've got news for you. 20 odd years ago, when we were starting to build our hosting environments, I remember I worked for the ISP that built a hosting environment. We built it not knowing at the time, or not sure of how we were going to sell it. We knew we had a local exchange point. Yes, exchange wasn't doing a lot of traffic in those days. But we also knew that we couldn't continue to ship our traffic from the bottom of the world all the way to Europe, only to come back to us. We needed to invest in infrastructure in our country. So this investment that I'm talking about is not one that you're going to see a return on in the next year or the next 2 years, probably not even the next 5 years. But you're looking at a 10 to 15-year investment here by saying, if I start educating my community about the value of having infrastructure local, yes, I'm not going to get them to respond immediately, but where will we be in 10 years' time? In 10 years' time, could we have this in my country? Unfortunately, businesses don't think like that. Businesses think in budget cycles, and it's very difficult to get businesses to understand that they need to have a 10-year view on how they want things to grow. If we had more time and we were talking about V6, a fascinating case story for a company with a long-term vision is Hurricane Electric and how they've built the IPv6 network. But that's a completely different story. So I always love to say that as operators, we have to learn to compete at commercial level, but collaborate at technical level. And that's for many reasons. Firstly, the techies in our community aren't always going to be working in the same network environment forever. They're going to move around. The guy that you think I'm not going to help today could actually be somebody who works for you tomorrow. So it's important that we try to scale up our community. Try to get them to understand the value of working together. And part of that collaboration is working together to build something, build the community, build the infrastructure, build the systems that will use the internet exchange. It might sound like I'm going on and on about this community thing and infrastructure thing, but that's because, as I said at the start, the elements that you need to build a working internet exchange point, it's not just the exchange. The exchange is the later switch. Really, that's very easy. If you're bored, I have switches under my desk. You're welcome to come hit me up and see if we can get one to you. But the exchange is useless without the back-end support. That's what you have to think about. How do I invest wisely in these people? And then once you have the exchange running, obviously the element that you're concerned about is growth. What is it about the exchange that's going to make people want to use it? And I think we're at a fortunate position, at least here, that we can still use our exchange points as technical advocacy. And we make a point of doing this with Jinx. We try to use the exchange to say, these are all the best practice technical things that you should be doing. So we routinely have we routinely have face-to-face meetings. We routinely have trainings. We routinely do things to show our peers what they should be doing. And whether that's investing in making sure that our services are all HTTPS only, whether it's investing in making sure that we run stuff through the Mozilla Observatory to make sure we get really good scores, checking your SSL certificates, call it whatever you want to do, right? We make sure we try to do that as best we can internally. We run our services because we want our people to learn how to use and build these services necessarily, rather than just saying, oh, well, it's easier to run email and Google, for example. So get your team, get your exchange to be the technical showcase. Get them to be the people that the people in your community come to ask for help. That's a good position to be in if you're an exchange point operator, because if people are asking you for what's best practice, then you have a chance to build and create that best practice. Particularly now, if you've been paying attention to the peering world, one of the things that's very exciting for a lot of people is RPKI, and there's a lot of misinformation that's flowing around about RPKI. Get your exchange, and it's a fantastic way to say, well, here's what the things that you should be interested in, and here's how you should be doing the next bit. And then, of course, if people are going to connect to your exchange points, they expect certain base services. And a good thing to do is to start running up community good services. And I've written community good services because they're the ones that you can typically run for cheap or for free. For example, Anycast DNS services. Again, at the end of this message, there'll be an email address for the outreach team, and you can write to us if you're running an exchange, or if you're thinking of starting an exchange, and we can help by providing one of our DNS nodes. DNS Anycast is a well understood concept. I'm not going to explain it here, but it's something that immediately helps to make the internet better in your country. That goes back to making the exchange a technical showcase for your environment. Run things that aren't well done in Africa. Now, I've put down NTP services, and you think, wow, Nishal, really? NTP services? But do yourself a favor. Go and see how many NTP services there are in your country, wherever your list is, wherever you're coming from. Go to pool.ntp.org and see if there's an NTP service in your country. It's really not a difficult thing to do, but there aren't a lot. I think in all of Africa, there's probably about 26, 27. And that's really, really, really low. But other community good services that you can do, which are probably also missing from your community, RPKI validators, run mailing lists for technical discussion. These are important things because all of this helps your community to build that one big T word, trust. And that trust has to be there if you hope to grow your internet exchange point. We've discussed this idea about hosting regular meetings. I firmly believe in it. I firmly believe that you have to engage your community because there's smart people in your community that you can find and perhaps hope to grow with you and your internet exchange as you build your exchange. And you can only do that by reaching out to them. So I'm going to pause for a second before we get to the next part of, we've spoken about what we need. We know we need to have an exchange. We spoke about the bits that you need to build an exchange. The last part's going to be all the things that could potentially go wrong. But before we get to that, I think Stephen, if there's a burning question that we need to address, this is the time for it.
Okay, Nishal. So we have a couple of questions. Yeah, the first one is, what is the better governance member to get involved to IXP sustainable growth?
I'm sorry, Stephen, I didn't get that part. What is the best? What is
the best governance, I suspect, model to get involved to IXP sustainable growth?
Okay, so the model that I always propose and the model that I endorse, and for all the exchange points that I volunteer my time with, the model that I suggest to them is the open community-run non-profit internet exchange point. I don't really believe that exchange points should be bothering themselves with money. For a lot of the exchange points in Africa, it's certainly not something that you want to do because every time, all the time that you spend figuring out how do I build this and how do I write a billing system or how do I make sure that this person's paying or how do I write an invoice, that's all time that you could be spending using to promote peering, okay? So make sure that your exchange is free, make sure that the exchange is community run. And that part's important, community run, because no one organization should own or manage or run that internet exchange point. The exchanges the ones in South Africa, case study here. The exchange points in South Africa, the community run ones now, used to be run by the Internet Service Providers Association in 1996. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. They were run like that probably until about 2012. And in 2012, we started to get external networks investing in our country, in South Africa. So external networks were putting infrastructure here. And the question that I raised to the exchange committee at the time was, guys, we have all of these foreign networks that are now coming into our country. All of these foreign networks are not part of the Service Providers Association. And if they're not part of the Service Providers Association, it means that they don't actually have a way of being involved in the decision-making ability of the internet exchange. And they thought about it, and we all agreed it made sense. So today, we run a completely open meaning anybody can participate, management committee. We have people that are on our management committee that are not from our country. We have people on our management committee that are not even peers at the internet exchange point, but they are solid individuals in the community that people know, and more importantly, individuals that people believe are wanting to do good for the internet exchange. So community, free, community run, and I think I've already explained the non-profit part of it, which is very important. You don't want the internet exchange trying to make a profit of the people that are connecting. You want it protected. In my country, at least, it's protected by law. In fact, in most of Africa, you can't buy and sell non-profits, so that's quite nice. Here, free, community-run, non-profit. That would be the governance model that I would advocate right from the start.
Next question is it the fact that setting up a cache at the IXP level, does that make the IXP more attractive compared to ISPs?
So I think it's important to think about, let's park that question actually. Let's talk about it when we talk about costs, which I'm going to talk about next, okay?
Good. So next is, you say no BGP protocol to route traffic, and how can we manage layer 2 only?
So an internet exchange point is a layer 2 construct. Let's be clear about that. An internet exchange point is just a switch. It is in today's terms, it is an Ethernet switch where everybody can connect, probably using fiber at 1 gig, 10 gig, 100 gig if you want. The internet exchange is a really, really stupid construct. It's that simple switch. That's the heart of the exchange, and it's a really, really silly thing. But what makes the exchange work is the fact that there are networks that are connected to the internet exchange. Now, the networks are responsible for running BGP. So perhaps the listener misheard me. The internet exchange doesn't have to worry about that. The networks that peer obviously need to run BGP to each other. As a service, the internet exchange operator might decide that they want to provide BGP route service. So it's generally a good thing to do. If you want to make it easy for people to use your internet exchange, particularly if you have more than 10 members, then having a BGP route server is a good thing to have. But a BGP route server is not essential to run an exchange point, and it's not how you would start. Maybe if you've got the time and energy and the skills and the hardware, absolutely, go ahead and do it if you can do it from the day one. But the network engineers at the service providers, those are the ones that need the BGP clue, not the guy in the middle.
Okay, thank you, Nishal. Next question is there any document, technical one, how to set up IXP from scratch?
Yes. Yes, there are. You've got me at a disadvantage. I don't know how to alt tab while this is on, but if you want to get the details of the person that has asked the question, I can get you the document that we promote, the PCH document, and it actually goes through all of this, how to set up an exchange from scratch. So what I can do as well is I can send you the URL after this is over.
All right, you send that to the AFRINIC team, you send it to Bashir, and he will share with all the participants.
Yep, I can do that.
Okay, next question is, what is the advantage of one country IXP to connect their ISP what is the advantage of one country IXP to connect the ISPs?
I don't quite get the question, but I think you're asking what's the advantages of interconnecting exchanges. I'll talk about that when I talk about things that can go wrong.
Okay. So could you please explain more about local loop in virtuous circle?
Okay, so the local loop is effectively how people in your environment connect to infrastructure. In context, it would be, for example, do you dial up to the internet? You know, the old 56K modems that people used to have. Do you use DSL? Do you use some kind of fixed wireless connection? Do you use some kind of cellular connection? Do you have fiber or microwave or something like that? It's the local loop would be the way that a local business or local communities or end users, if you want, how they connect to the internet. You can't hope, as I was explaining earlier on, one of the things that's driving large chunks of internet usage in South Africa at the moment is the fact that people now have fiber to the home. And because they have fiber to the home, they can get 100 megabit links, or I think in some cases even gigabit links. And that's what's driving a lot of the high capacity internet access that's happening right now. You can't get high capacity internet access if you don't have decent local loops, good local loops, stable local loops, high speed local loops.
Okay. You mentioned in the slide that building data center to run IX is a recipe for failure. Is that always true?
Yes. A data center, so let's look at the costs behind this. An exchange point, to build an exchange is really, really simple. To build an exchange, you need an Ethernet switch. Ethernet switches are not that expensive if you want to start, okay? And if you are a non-profit exchange, those switches are free because people can donate them to you. But a data center, on the other hand, is something fantastic. It is a very expensive construct to build. You know, it's going to run into millions of dollars to build a data center, depending, of course, on the size and type of data center that you're looking at building. It makes no sense to me that you want to spend all of this money, this say $1 million there on a data center, to put in a simple switch, which is $2,000, maybe $3,000 or so. That makes no sense. On the other hand, if you have a data center, an excellent thing to have in a data center that has a lot of carriers in it is an internet exchange point. So let's go through this carefully. Not having anything and then saying, I want an exchange, therefore I'm building a data center first. Bad idea, because you're spending a lot of money on the data center and you're not sure if the exchange is going to be working. But if you've done the math, if you've gotten the business investment for whatever reason, from whatever purposes, if you've got your business partners, you've built a data center, and then you put in an internet exchange point for an additional $2,000, that's not a bad thing to do. Because an exchange in a data center is a recipe for the data center to grow. Now, of course, it depends on the type of data center. There's data centers that are built for compute, which is, you know, high capacity, only 2 or 3 customers in here. And all that we're doing is we're going to crunch numbers to support some kind of cloud application. That's the wrong kind of data center to have an internet exchange point in. But if you have a data center that has a lot of different operators in it, because all of the operators don't necessarily have their own infrastructure, that's the kind of data center. We call them carrier neutral. That's the kind of data center you would want to have an exchange. So I think maybe we should go to the last part of this and then wind back and take any last questions, because there's still quite a bit to talk about in the things that can go wrong.
All right, cool. Go ahead.
Right. So let's talk about the things that could go wrong now that you've built an exchange point. And the first part of it is you try to increase the cost for peers to run. We've spoken about this at length already, but if you make it expensive for people to use your internet exchange point, people are not going to use your exchange point. And I wish that this is something you want to brand onto the forehead and the forearm of every single exchange point operator. Don't make the exchange expensive for people to use. So, and that should be your motto, really. In whatever you do, don't make the exchange expensive for people to use, because if it is, they won't use it. Okay. So how do we minimize costs at the internet exchange point? Well, first, don't go and invent work. So I said that the exchange point should be an area that you can use to showcase technical excellence. And I firmly believe that. I firmly believe that if you've got the spare time, if you've got the cycles, then use the exchange to promote best practices. Use the exchange to promote all those good things that we talk about, because it's important, right? It really is important. But don't go and hire somebody to do all of this stuff, right? And then say, well, we're going to bill the person that did all of this stuff back to the internet exchange point. And the people that are going to pay for it are the people at the exchange point. Because now you're making the exchange more expensive. if you have volunteers that can do this, and this goes back to why you need to leverage your community, because volunteers come at zero cost. If you have volunteers that are willing to do this, awesome, brilliant. But to hire individuals, creating work, inventing work, to create costs to do these things, that's not going to leverage your peers. That's not going to help your peers invest in your internet exchange point and peer with each other. Okay? Competing with peers for services. An internet exchange is a really simple construct. As I said, it's a switch and providers speak BGP to each other across that switch. But because of its location in the internet ecosystem, it's very tempting for people to say, well, if I connect, it's tempting for somebody to say that if I put my server at the internet exchange point and I connect my server to the internet exchange point, then I immediately have really, really fast connectivity to all the networks that are there. It's absolutely true, by the way. It is absolutely true. But it's a bad idea for the exchange point to become a hosting provider. It's a bad idea for the exchange point to try to sell VMs, because this is the sort of thing that your peers are doing. What you are doing as the exchange, if you do this, is you're acting unfairly. You're asking all of these networks to connect to your exchange at their cost, and then you're just going to try to promote or sell your services on top of that. If you're doing it as a social good project, that's different. If you're providing it at no cost as a social good project, that's different, but make sure you get your peers to agree to this sort of stuff first, okay? Because if you start to run it as a professional business, i.e. hosting at the exchange by the exchange, all that's going to happen is your network operators, the people that run businesses, the people that run this as their business, are going to say, this doesn't work right for us. This doesn't work for us. You are using us to resell your services, and we're going to disconnect and maybe start a different exchange somewhere else. And that has happened in the world, by the way. Internet exchanges that try to sell professional services have had lost peers who started alternate exchange points. So don't compete with your peers. Now, I use the example of hosting, but another way that we talk about competing with peers is also when we talk about this idea that people have about interconnecting exchange points. Exchange points do not interconnect with each other. This is a very, very misunderstood thing. But the simple truth is that there is no economic model for an internet exchange point to connect with another internet exchange point. We don't have the time here because you're restricted. You said 2 hours. We don't have the time here to discuss all of that, and maybe we can do that in a later meeting, because that in itself is an hour-long presentation on why connecting internet exchange points to each other is a bad idea. It's a bad idea because it doesn't promote growth in the economy. There is no economic model. You are effectively have to find a way for someone to take something free and give it free to yet another party. There's no model for doing that. When exchange points interconnect, there's no party that can pay for the fiber between the internet exchange point on a long-term basis. There are lots of experiments, by the way. There are lots of experiments where exchange points have tried to interconnect with other exchange points. They have found funding for the fiber to interconnect them. And when that funding dried up, guess what happened? They've had to disconnect because nobody's going to pay, particularly if you are a not-for-profit community-run exchange point. How would you pay for fiber to connect to another internet exchange? And if you were going to raise funds to do that, if you were going to raise funds to pay for that fiber, all that you are doing by raising funds is that you are increasing the cost to run the exchange. If you increase the cost to run the exchange point, people are not going to want to peer. And if people don't want to peer, your exchange doesn't become successful. So don't compete with your peers for services. Don't try to do that. Instead, what you want to do is you want to make it easy for people that are far away to get connected to you. I'm in South Africa, in Johannesburg, so we want to make it easy for operators that are in Gaborone, for example, to be able to connect to South Africa, because that's a good thing. And in fact, that's what we do have. Cross-border interconnection, that's the goal. Exchange points don't cross borders, network operators cross borders. But yeah, maybe we can do a whole webinar on that some other time. Common mistake is running an all-boys club. I used the example a little earlier on when I was speaking about Liberia. But a common question is, who should connect to an exchange? Now, maybe I'm part of the problem, I guess, because I'm old. And in my slides, I write ISPs. But the issue is that an exchange is not just for internet service providers. And if you run the exchange point as a thing that is meant only for internet service providers, you're doing yourselves and your community a disservice. Who should be able to connect to an exchange? Anybody. PCH isn't an internet service provider. We provide DNS services. But today we connect at almost 200 exchange points across the world. If we were not able to connect to 200 exchange points across the world because exchange point operators were closed-minded, we would not be able to provide you with root DNS services that we do for the operators that we support. We would not be able to provide you with the TLD services for the operators that we support. And in the event of there being large denial of service attacks and things like that on the DNS, we would have a less effective internet. Don't restrict who can connect to your IX. The simple rule should be, you would like to connect? Great. Do you have an autonomous system number? You do? Great. Do you have your own IP addresses? That's all we need. And of course, the AFRINIC team can help you figure out how to get your autonomous system numbers and your IP addresses. But in general, if somebody has an ASN and their IPs, they're good enough to be connected to the exchange point. I've written misalignment on the IX roles, and that's because there's often confusion as to what an exchange point should do. I sometimes get called in to help when exchange points get blamed for things like TLDs failing, or exchange points get blamed for things that are not directly related to the simple basic function that the exchange is meant to provide. And that is acting as just a neutral connection point. The other stuff that I'm speaking about, the training, the best practices, those are things that you can do as part of building the community because you need the community to peer. But never confuse that with the exchange's role, which is help us move packets and move packets cheaply and effectively. And that's it. When the exchange decides to do things like run their own business, web hosting company, when the exchange decides to try to interconnect with another exchange and then try to seek funding to do that because, well, it needs to pay for the fiber, those are not understanding the role of the internet exchange. And those are things that will drive the internet exchange to failure. And finally, betting on one horse. And this is probably something that I think we need to spend time thinking how we explain this within our communities. When I talk about exchange points, I talk about exchange points and how they work within an economy. And that economy could be national, that economy could be provincial, it could be city. But that's how you need to think about exchange points. How they work within a specific context. It's wrong to think of national internet exchange points. And this is unfortunately a habit that some of the governments have. When they start to point to national exchanges, you don't want national exchange points. You want, because a national exchange point implies that there's only going to be one of them. And unless you're a really small country, so the guys in Mauritius will know this, Mauritius is a small country. So unless you're a really small country, you almost always want to have more than one internet exchange point, right? You'd want to start with an exchange point wherever there is economic activity, telecommunications infrastructure, and people. So I use South Africa. We have 3 large cities, Johannesburg, Durban, Cape Town, and we have exchange points in each of these. Tanzania has 5 exchange points, I think. Kenya has 2, Nigeria has 2 now. But there are a whole bunch of other countries that need to start thinking about how do we grow our existing exchange point, which might be inside our capital city, but also how do we start developing and growing exchange points in other regions? Because all the reasons for building that first exchange point, all of those reasons are very, very valid when it comes to building your second internet exchange point. So for example, if I was in Sudan, if I think about the Sudanese, 40 million people, lots of people in Khartoum, but also lots of people in Port Sudan. Port Sudan to me is a natural place for a second potential internet exchange point. Now, I'm using this as an example. I assume that somebody is going to have to do a study to figure out if it's got the people, if it's got the telecoms infrastructure, and if it's got the internet economy happening there. But if it does, then they're far enough. I mean, we're looking at distances of what, 600 odd kilometers. They're far enough for you to be able to say, yes, there's a real saving in us building an internet exchange point here in the city because it is far away. What there's no value in doing is in saying that inside Khartoum, there is an exchange, let's build another one. Because that doesn't help. That's just increasing the cost for the operators in your city, because then the operators in your city, some might go to exchange point 1, some might go to exchange point 2. So within an economy, within an environment, you want to have one exchange point, one switch fabric. When that hits a certain size, and that size is something that your community determines. So this is where it gets a bit tricky. That size is something your community determines. But when it gets to that certain size, your community might decide, wow, this is amazing enough for us that it works. We want another one inside the same environment, maybe in a different data center, maybe far away, so that we have resiliency within the city. But resiliency within a city should not come at the expense of you not investing in infrastructure in other cities, in other places inside your country. So I want to say this again, national exchange point thinking, that's a bad mindset. Don't think about national exchanges. It's true, some are going to be larger than the others. That's just a function of where people live, population, economic growth, etc., etc. But don't limit your thinking by saying we want to limit where and how we build exchanges. And that's what I mean by betting on one horse. So those are some of the things that typically go wrong when we start thinking about internet exchange point failure. I can go on, but you told me to prepare for 2 hours, and it is exactly 4:30. So I think we have the next set of questions.
Thank you, Nishal, for the brilliant presentation. We have 7 questions. Let's run through them. So the first one is, how can we convince local clients, e.g. banks, to connect to IX?
How can you convince banks to connect to your internet exchange point? Well, it's about getting them to understand that there is value in interconnection, right? Getting them to understand that what they spend on their internet transit could be made better if they saw the internet traffic as a component of local services and domestic, foreign services. And banks actually are not that difficult, because if you think about a bank, most of the clients of a bank are likely going to be within your country, right? So banks understand where their customers are better than you might think. They understand that their customers are domestic. What you've got to do is sell them on the idea that they can have unfettered access to domestic customers if they can get access to the domestic internet exchange point. So if it's, whether it's promote internet banking, whether it's to promote making their services faster, whether it's to give them a competitive edge over the other one, it's about getting them to understand that your customers, particularly you, Mr. Bank, particularly you, Mr. Government, all of your customers are domestic. If your customers are domestic, here's where you can get the best spread of domestic users at the domestic internet exchange point.
Okay. So how can we, okay, that's one of the largest IX in the world is also one of the most expensive. How is it so?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. It's because the IX funds other things with its build. It is not just an internet exchange point. It's not an exchange that is doing what I'm talking about, which is how do you get exchange points started? You minimize your costs. They're an exchange that acts more like a carrier, a network carrier. And to be honest, that's not a scalable way to succeed. It might sound like they're successful, but don't confuse size for success. There are lots of things that differentiate an internet exchange from a carrier, one of which is the laws around how carriers and exchange point functions in most countries. Exchange points are not well defined. And that's probably a good thing for now, okay? But when exchanges start to become more and different, when exchange points start to become specialized transport carriers, then they should be taxed and they should be put into the brackets of how carriers perform. So in terms of things like contributing towards USF and stuff like that, when they have to start doing that, they start to realize that they're not actually going to be cut out to be a carrier. So I honestly do. I think it's a thing that people are going through right now. A few exchange points, not a lot of them, just a few. And it's not something they're going to be able to sustain. We've already seen cases where exchanges that are doing this, that are building in other cities across the world, that are extending into other cities across the world, have had to shut down some of those operations. I don't want to name names, but they've had to shut them down because they're not economically feasible, they're not viable. And I think that this experiment will continue for a while, but it's not going to last.
Okay. So next question is, which automating tools will you recommend to IX managers?
Okay, that's a good question as well. Which automation tools? So it's difficult to recommend stuff without knowing what platform you have. So some infrastructure supports automation better than other infrastructure. That's an open secret, right? So for example, the Extreme Kit, we use Extreme at our exchange point. The Extreme Kit isn't notorious for helping to automate stuff, but I'm told Arista is much, much better, Mellanox is much, much better, Cumulus, etc., etc. So it would be difficult for me to make a recommendation to say that this was going to work for you. I don't know what you have. What I can tell you about is a fantastic tool called IXP Manager. It's written and managed by the Irish Internet Exchange Pod called INEX. It's a great tool that will help you automate things like your route servers, if you're going to do that, if you're going to run route servers. It'll help you automate the functioning of things like assigning IP addresses. Remember I said one of the key things you have to worry about is not to assign the same address twice. So it will help you to do a little things like that. If you want to write to me, my details are on the screen, and tell me what you're using in terms of infrastructure. I can try and make recommendations as to automation tools. But in general, I expect the usual Ansible, salt stack stuff. It's probably going to come down to that.
Thank you. Next question is, there is a concept of regional IXPs recently developed. It is understood that regional IXP should peer between them to keep local to the regional traffic, East Africa, SADC, and so on. What is your opinion on peering between regional IXPs within a region?
Okay, so firstly, there's no such thing as a regional IXP, right? I mean, what is a regional IXP? Is it an exchange that serves a particular region? So in French, my French is really bad, but I understand in French, region means province. So is a regional exchange point a provincial exchange point that serves a particular region? Is a regional exchange point an exchange point that has traffic from networks that are not from itself? So for example, if I'm in South Africa, would a regional exchange point in South Africa be traffic that comes from, say, the UK to South Africa? And that's what people usually think about, right? So there's two parts to your question. The first is, exchange points do not connect with other exchange points. Regardless of what you are as an exchange, you don't connect with another exchange. It's not how we do things. And Muko, if you're listening, I think that maybe this is the subject of your next webinar. Why do exchange points not connect with other exchange points? But they don't. There's no model for exchanges to connect with each other. What you want what I heard from the question is what we want is to keep traffic in a region. So for example, if I'm in Zimbabwe, actually that's too easy. If I'm in Malawi and I want to send traffic to South Africa, even though we are not neighbors immediately, we still want traffic to flow along path and not have to go to Europe and come to us. I think that's the goal. That's what we want. So what you're asking for is not for a regional exchange point to connect to another regional exchange point. Okay? Those things don't make sense. What you're asking for is better cross-border traffic. That's what we want. We want traffic from my border to somehow be able to find its way directly, hopefully the shortest path to the Malawian border, and for the return traffic to come back via an equally cheap short path. That's what we need. We need better cross-border traffic. How do we do that? Well, that's very simple. We need to first engage our regulators to make sure that the rules for crossing traffic, the rules for cross-border traffic interconnection are there, okay? That it is open and fair to any operator that is able to build to the border to be able to communicate with somebody that's across the border. And this might seem fairly obvious to you, but it wasn't always the case. It wasn't always the case. I remember one country that neighbors mine that was complaining that its costs were so high. And the reason that its costs were so high was that it had signed an agreement with the incumbent. The incumbent in that country had signed an agreement with the incumbent in my country. And because they were the only ones that were permitted to change traffic between borders, well, guess what? The incumbent in my country was charging them a lot to change traffic. They sent in the relevant notices to break the agreement. They opened up their side of the border to say anybody can connect to us. And suddenly their costs have dropped dramatically because the incumbent locally had to do the same. Didn't really have a leg to stand on anymore. So we need, this is a good question. It's a common question. How do we improve cross-border connections? Regulatory policy has to be there. And then infrastructure has to be there. Is there fiber between the places that we want to connect to? Okay, probably not. But if there's no fiber, why isn't there fiber? Is there a case for investment here? And whether that investment comes from private sector investment or whether it comes from public-private partnership, some kind of PPP thing, it's good to understand where the gaps are and to pave the way for us to fill those gaps. The problem, I think, the problem is not that there isn't a dearth of people willing to do investment. It's that in a lot of cases, the regulatory framework for us is not there. It's there if you look within a region, right? So generally, the cross-border connectivity within SADC, I know that area quite well, is generally not a problem. Cross connectivity between the East, the ACO region, actually works really well. But try going from east to north. Okay, not so well defined. Those are the things that we need to fix. So instead of trying to build this big exchange point and then build another big exchange point somewhere else and then say, how do we get these things to work? Because by the way, if you're going to connect the exchanges, you still need the rules for cross-fiber border to work, cross-border fiber to work. Let's try and harmonize that instead. Let's open up the borders. Let's say these are the rules, and these are standard open rules for how border can cross the fibers. Let's make it open. Let's make it cheap, so nobody has to pay unnecessary, stupid duties just to get fiber across the border. And when we do that, well, we'll get what we want, which is traffic to stay regional.